remember our life before AIDS, a more carefree life. In those days we were all criminals, and we might have feared what our parents or workmates would say about our sex lives. But the fear of death had not yet arrived. The fear which was to envelop the gay communities as the 80s went on. In Wellington in the early 80s, in the world before Grindr, there was the Dorian on a Friday and Saturday night. There were dances up at the university every few weeks. There was chatting in the community centre, and there was meeting guys at the sauna. And for me, there was the gay switchboard. A handful of guys who played an important role in the story. People would bring us at the switchboard to find out what was going on, to talk about gay life and how they might join in it. From 1981, we started to hear stories of a health crisis among gay men in New York. At first, we tried not to know too much. We remained in denial as long as we could, but gradually we absorbed some of the details. There was open talk in the American gay press about a deadly plague of unknown origin, involving many different kinds of cancer, skin lesions, pneumonia, wasting, and other diseases. Once these serious medical conditions started, patients lasted only a few weeks or a few months. In those days, we didn't know about a virus. We didn't know about HIV. We didn't know how it was transmitted. More and more, we started to talk about it in the gay switchboard. It was actually in the gay switchboard that I met this man here, Rob Lake. He's been in this thing with us right through, with all his courage and empathy and humour and love. He went on to some really big jobs dealing with HIV in Australia, and it's so great to have you back, Rob. The real start to AIDS in New Zealand was in 1984, 40 years ago. People who'd become sick with AIDS were starting to come home, and the media were going wild about it. The huge wave of fear about AIDS, which was sweeping the Western world, arrived. Gay men were terrified of what they were about to face, and the rest of the population was terrified of gay men. It was very difficult to remain calm. Pushed on by Bruce Burnett and Phil Parkinson, the gay switchboard in Wellington got the AIDS Support Network going here. The AIDS Support Network, of course, was the original name of the Burnett Foundation. At first, we saw ourselves as an ancillary volunteer support network. I remember a weekend at the end of October in 1984 in Turnbull House on Bulcott Street, where we sat on the floor and Bruce talked about his work in the Shanty Project in San Francisco with people who had AIDS. There's a photo of a very young Rob Lake there that weekend at Turnbull House. We watched Shanty Project videos of conversations with people at various stages of HIV illness and their carers, and we talked about grief and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and we did role plays, and we started our adjustment to the new reality of a world with AIDS. At about the same time, during a single week, the gate switchboard had 2 calls. One was from a sick young man called Gary, just returned from Australia. His family was not coping, and he needed support and an appropriate doctor. The other call was from the medical officer of health, alerting us to the same person. She believed this man was on the loose in Wellington, being sexually irresponsible and spreading contagion. The next night, 2 or 3 of us met with the medical officer of health and John Miller, who was the main gay doctor in town. I don't know if you remember that meeting, Rob, but you were certainly there. I think it was that night we started to realise that in this crisis we were not going to be able to depend on the good sense of the official health apparatus. We were going to need something far more than a bunch of volunteers. On the Saturday morning, a day or so later, I took Gary to Dr. John's house. We had a cup of tea, and then I left Gary and John for a consultation. Now, John at that point knew as much about AIDS as anyone in the country, and he was to go on to offer amazing support to the first cohort of people with AIDS in Wellington. But when he rang me up that afternoon to say he thought the consultation with Gary had gone quite well, he confessed, sheepishly, because he knew it was stupid, he confessed that he'd just boiled the teacup Gary had used. Now that was the environment of 1984. For some time, that was the kind of fear of contagion that permeated every interaction between people with AIDS and the people around them, including people in the professional world. And then there were the deaths. In the later 80s and early 90s, there were some terrible times. Many of us survived. Some of us have had pretty good lives, but all of us have been touched by tragedy, and we leave huge parts of ourselves behind. I made a list of names I remember from the 80s and 90s, guys who died of AIDS. Some were dear, dear friends. Some I didn't know so very well. But I knew each of them well enough to recall them. There are 50 on that list. 3 of them were called Gary. They were mostly Wellington men I might have expected to continue to have as part of my life for the rest of my life. But they've gone. Some of the men of my age, or a little longer, a little younger, lost all the best friends of their 20s. The effects are a bit like the effects of the First or Second World Wars, which left generations of psychologically wounded men. The death of so many friends has a lasting impact. Some of the survivors are pretty knocked around. So now, tonight I'm thinking of the men I knew who have died, men I worked with fighting for gay rights, men whose company I enjoyed, men I danced with, men I loved. I'm thinking of those who survived too. It's important to have a day to think of these people, because without the prompt of a special day, some of us would forget to pause and remember, and we won't help the hurt by forgetting. It's certainly true that renewing our good and happy memories cannot be done without renewing the pain. But these men deserve to be remembered, We deserve the remembering. We need to take a moment to embrace the pain as a mark of the joy they gave. Gradually, perhaps, we will achieve a peace with the remembering. Today we remember not only those who were so very much a part of our lives, but all the other people AIDS connected us to. The women and children who had AIDS. There's some moving footage of Eve van Grafthorst in the audio-visual presentation we had earlier today. There were many people who went through this with the gay community. People who got AIDS from blood transfusions or from sharing needles or recreational drug use. And the connections made have lasted forever. And it's not just the people who actually had AIDS, it's all the people around us and around them. Their families, some were brilliant. The volunteers, many lesbians who helped, doctors and nurses. Remember all these people we met along the way. Remember also some who were not quite so good. Families that didn't do so well. Medical personnel who took some time to conquer their fears. Some hospices would not take people with AIDS. There were nasty incidents in workplaces. There were foul placards and t-shirts on the streets. There were frothing politicians trying to keep us down. We faced massive stigma, and we took it on. We took it on. It was worst in the homosexual law reform campaign, and we won. But that fight against stigma continues. Much of the fight was in response to negligent, sluggardly politicians, especially in the heartland of AIDS, America. Much was against the pharmaceutical companies and their belief that they have private ownership over the advances of science. We've made huge strides in limiting that. And curiously, some of those strides that we made have helped in the response to COVID. We've not always been sufficiently conscious, perhaps, of people in countries which are not industrially developed. 2/3, I think, of the people who have lived and died of AIDS have lived and died in Africa. We might have neglected them too much, but we have had an impact there too. We have made them distribute effective medications to a better extent over the years. So tonight we look back over 40 years. This room contains some profound grief, so much loss, so many who should be here to share the good times. But mixed with this grief, there should be a sense that we represent a movement which has pushed the world forward a bit, which has altered the balance a little, that has transformed the life prospects of those who remain, both here and around the world. In memory of our losses, we must continue to work for a world in which there are fewer such losses, and a world which is a fairer place. So let's continue to push for access to cutting-edge medicine. Let's continue to fight for the right to health. Tēnā koutou katoa.